Chapter 10. The security clearance Tara requested for Adeena had been denied. There was no reason provided by either the Ottawa Police or the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. There was just a simple X in one of the checkboxes beside the Denied option on the form for Level 1 Security Clearance Certificate in regards to Adeena Rose Stewart. Getting that certificate was a requirement of the insurance company for any person with private access to the Duncan Cello. Tara had worried this would happen. She wondered what sort of file there might be on Adeena, who had suffered more than a few brushes with the law during her stormy teenage years. As Tara left her office to deliver the bad news, she recalled one awful summer night in particular, soon after they had both turned 18. Adeena had gone to a party that ended wildly out of control. Kurt, the boyfriend Adeena swooned over and Tara loathed, had invited his mates from the avant-garde rock band that he and Adeena had formed. They in turn invited their friends, and it seemed to Tara most of the entire grade 12 class at Nepean High School, to a backyard pool party at his sprawling Westboro house. His parents, of course, were out of town for the weekend. By the time the police arrived, the flashing lights of their cruisers washing over the whole neighborhood, Kurt's house and the party were in shambles. There was a motorcycle in the pool, and the police arrested a couple of kids dealing drugs. Adeena was charged after getting into a nasty catfight with one of the other girls, who told the police that she wanted to press charges. Tara had stood up for her friend, telling the police that Adeena was acting in self-defense when she punched the bitch in the head and knocked her into the pool. The fact that Adeena had then jumped into the water to bite said bitch was harder to explain. Oh, Miss Adeena. Was she the sister Tara never had? She had certainly created enough trouble for the both of them. Tara's parents would never put up with the stunts Adeena pulled. A Greek father and an Indian mother. You don't just fuck around with them. They were results people. One a lawyer, the other a deputy minister in the government. And they made it clear they had zero tolerance for teenage nonsense. Tara had just accepted that as a fact of Indo-Greek life. As she strode towards Adeena's office, Tara mused how she had vicariously lived her teenage years through her best friend. She had nursed Adeena through bad relationships, lectured her on drugs, booze, and sex, and helped her deal with problems that seemed to follow her around every corner. And she had been there after the prom when Adeena overdosed and lay near death in the hospital for 2 long days and 2 even longer nights. Surviving her best friend's teenage years had been exhausting. Tara had sacrificed so much as Adeena's eternally patient guardian angel that she never had the chance at introspection to figure out who she was or what she wanted from life. Maybe when I hit 30, she thought with a smile as she reached Adeena's office, I'll quit my job, travel to Greece, and track down the god of debauchery, or a rugged guy that looks a lot like him. I'll get drunk, smoke cigarettes, and have an orgy for a whole month. Tara walked into Adeena's office and braced herself. Dee, you've been a naughty girl. I can't get your security clearance approved. She tried to strike a sympathetic tone. I'm going to keep working on it, but I'll need your help. Adeena sat engrossed on her computer. She didn't react the way Tara had expected. Jerks. Adeena finally responded without taking her eyes from the computer screen. Tara sighed. Well, until I can find out what skeletons they've unearthed. You can't be alone with a Duncan Cello. We'll have to keep the music technician around to play it for now. You're not authorized. Adeena looked up at Tara blankly. Really, she said, releasing a sigh of disgust before turning back to the screen, peering closely at the web page she had been absorbed in studying. Tara always had a hard time understanding her friend. Why did she attract problems to herself like moths to a floodlight? Why couldn't Adeena learn that dreams usually turn out to be fantasies that lead you over a cliff? Why did she always choose the rockiest road, the one that led nowhere, or to a place of pain, misery? Is that why she can't get a Level 1 security certificate? Tara thought. Is she just a pathological rule breaker? Tara looked at her best friend, her sister, and unfortunately the subordinate she was supposed to manage. Adeena sat reading the computer screen, ignoring Tara as if she wasn't even there. That trip to Greece sounds really good, Tara thought. How's your research going for the exhibit? She finally offered. You like the name we came up with? Art of Rebellion. There was a pause, and Adeena finally turned her head and looked serious. I do, she replied, still absorbed by the article on the screen. Did you know the Duncan Cello had a direct role in the rebellion? The 1745 Jacobite uprising? Adeena had a faraway look in her eyes. I didn't really know about it before, but I'm starting to get it now. I feel very connected to it somehow. Tara studied Adeena. She always took everything to an impossible level. You do? Why? Tara replied. Then she noticed the reflection on Adeena's hand. What's this? It's from Philip. You're wearing it on your right hand? Adeena looked down and took the ring off. I shouldn't be wearing it on any hand. She closed her fingers around it and stared at the ground. Tara couldn't believe what she was hearing. You said no? Adeena nodded. Tara moved closer and touched Adeena's shoulder. He loves you. I thought you... It's not him, Adeena interrupted. I'm not ready, or I'm not... She paused, looking up as if searching for an answer. Or you're not what? I don't know exactly. Maybe not ready to be his wife, she sighed. Why? Is there somebody else? Adeena hesitated. It's my music, Tara. I'm so focused right now. I think I've finally found my voice. Tara bit her lip, frowning. Music was always tied to heartbreak for Adeena, from two-timing Kurt and their punkish band that went nowhere, through 10 years of auditions with bad endings and projects. Dee, will that really make you happy? Tara started, forming the outline of another counseling session in her head. I thought you were paddling over Niagara Falls with this whole music thing. I was, but yesterday I got invited to join the NAC orchestra. Tara's heart jumped. Finally, after all these years. What? You didn't tell me that. Adeena smiled, and Tara leaned over the chair and wrapped her arms around her neck. Congratulations! She felt such pride for her friend. Adeena had been through so much to finally get to this day. The NAC orchestra. It always seemed like a wild dream that would end in crushing disappointment. A tap on the open office door interrupted them. It was Tara's new assistant, Pablo, on his second day at work. His wife was an old friend, and Tara had given the young art history graduate a term assignment as a favor to her. Ms. Cormos, he said, looking like he had some important news. They really need you to look at something for the new exhibit. Then he added with a sense of urgency. They want you to come and see it right now. Tara motioned for Adeena to follow her. Thanks, Pablo. We're on our way. Traveling exhibits at the National Gallery of Canada brought in much-needed revenue to the institution. Hopes were high that The Art of Rebellion, featuring the Duncan Cello which had received so much media coverage, would be a smashing success, both artistically and, perhaps more importantly, financially. Adeena had managed to get the star artifact of the show back to the gallery on Saturday morning without incident, thanks to Michael. She knew it wasn't fair to flirt with the young clerk who had worked the weekend shift in security. But no crime was committed, Adeena rationalized. No one was harmed through her using an instrument that needed to be played every day, and that seemed to belong to her anyway. Like the sign, Tara interrupted as they approached the entrance to the area of the gallery where temporary exhibits were staged. Adeena studied the huge hanging banner, a photograph of the Duncan Cello trimmed to the contours on the right side. It was so large that it dominated the 3-story glass atrium. An even larger version hung outside the gallery. The lettering was simple, written as if in haste, with the splotched ink drops of a sloppy quill. Art of Rebellion. Art de la Rébellion. The silhouette of a bayonet-tipped musket served as an accent under the lettering. The background imagery was a landscape painting of misty Scottish highlands. Adeena stared at it for a moment, thinking about Catherine Carnegie and her 2 brothers, George and the captain. And of course the young man, James Drummond. She had just been reading about them online in her attempt to sort out the characters of her dream. The people she had met were all real, and Kinnaird was real. How could she have dreamed of historical characters and places she was completely unaware of last week? Had she heard it all before and simply forgotten? Strange, though, she had yet to find anything on Catherine Carnegie. There was nothing anywhere on her, from Wikipedia to the extensive subscription-only databases she had access to through her National Gallery research account. Tara touched Adeena's shoulder, bringing her back to the present with a start. Let's take a look, Tara said, motioning Adeena forward. The women, along with Pablo, walked past the signage through a wide entrance into the exhibit. One wall had been set up to resemble the exterior of a castle, and 2 mannequins dressed as soldiers faced off against each other. One was dressed as a Highland clansman, wearing a blue bonnet, plaid waistcoat, and a tartan kilt. His sword was thrust straight ahead, threatening the other man, meticulously outfitted as an English redcoat, with his long red uniform covering his knees and hiding most of his earthen-colored breeches. The redcoat aimed his bayonet-tipped musket directly at the head of the clansman. "What do you think, Dee?" Tara mused. "Like to have these two over for drinks sometime." Adeena stood in silence. The English soldier reminded her of the men who had cheered on her performance. But these were lifeless mannequins, who seemed like wannabe models for 18th century military fashion. "Is it historically accurate?" Tara asked. "You've been researching this stuff, haven't you?" "Yes, I have. But they are too pretty, too clean, too neat," Adeena responded. "They didn't look like this. These guys look more like they want to pose for Abercrombie and Fitch." Adeena shuffled around the mannequins, touching the buttons on the redcoat's uniform. "We need to give them some grit, some life," she said. "They didn't have dry cleaning back then. Why don't we dirty them up a bit?" Tara shook her head in disagreement. "No can do," she said. "We got these from the National Museums in Edinburgh. I believe they are big fans of dry cleaning." Adeena turned away from the mannequins. She looked around at the portraits and the paintings on the walls as Tara was called away with a question from the carpenter. He was building another wall that needed to look as though it were made of stone. A shiver of déjà vu shook Adeena's shoulders. She felt undone standing here, staring at these reflections of characters frozen in time, their passions long forsaken. They were now reduced to stiff, lifeless portraitures, static faces masked in the fiery spirit that she knew burned inside. She looked more closely at one portrait in particular of a man who looked oddly familiar. She stared again, reading the description beside the portrait. It was James Drummond, the tall man who had been smitten by her performance at Kinnaird. In the portrait, his square shoulders and stoic face belied the charm he had conveyed in their brief encounter following her performance. Taking advantage of Tara's distraction with the carpenter, Adeena squinted and pitched her head from side to side, feeling the memory of James's face pulse to life. She shut her eyes to help conjure the feeling of seeing him, and then alternated opening and closing her left and right eyelids. After a moment, the eyes in the painting seemed to come alive. James was staring down at Adeena, his eyes locked on hers. She blushed as memories of the gleam of gold, the clink of glasses, twinkling chandeliers, the aroma of a wood fire, and the perfumed necks of the ladies flooded over her. He held his gaze on her, and she felt her cheeks growing warm. And then he bowed gracefully, lowering his head and his shoulders in respect. He rose from the bow and raised a hand towards her, and seemed to mouth, "My lady." Adeena snapped back from her haze to see James's portrait, stiff and dreary. In those few moments she had had with him, she knew his spirit better than any art historian could ever hope. "Dee, take a look at this!" Tara called out to her. Adeena looked over at the huge fresco on the opposite wall. It was a scene that featured a musical performance and what looked like a woman playing the Duncan cello. Was it Catherine Carnegie performing at Kinnaird Castle? Adeena froze, staring at the fresco. Am I going mad? There was that boxy piano and the other musicians from her dream, the violinist and the man on the viola. There was the same gathering of men and women, dressed like those she had seen. Adeena moved closer to read the description of the art. Preparing for war. A musical recital in 1745 inspires Jacobite supporters to pledge allegiance to Bonnie Prince Charles, son of the young pretender who would be king. "This is where we'll display the Duncan cello," Tara announced, pointing to a wooden podium that the carpenter was sanding. Adeena nodded, still absorbed by the fresco. "You're displaying the Duncan cello here?" she asked doubtfully. "Yep. And see those lights in the ceiling?" Tara replied, raising her arm upward to a set of recessed pot lights aimed at the podium under construction. "It will light up very dramatically. And I was thinking maybe we need a soundtrack to play in the background. What do you think, Dee?" Adeena frowned. Once the exhibit opened in 2 weeks, all the flirting in the world wasn't going to help her get close to the Duncan. Only that dim-witted music technician would get to play it as part of the cello's maintenance regimen. "Well?" Tara repeated, still waiting for Adeena's response. "I think that for once, Tara, you need to trust me," she huffed. "I can maintain the Duncan cello better than any jerk-off music tech guy, and we both know it." "Can we discuss this somewhere else?" Tara responded as the carpenter chuckled to himself. Pablo stood beside her, rocking uneasily. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to put it quite that way," Adeena said, softening her tone. "The Duncan cello needs a professional musician to play it. Is there no way around the stupid security certificate thing, Tare?" "Absolutely not," Tare replied forcefully. "You know, Dee, I'm really tired of always cleaning up after you. It's not my job to be your fairy godmother and grant your 3 wishes whenever you don't get your way." "So that's it then?" Adeena asked. Why couldn't Tara relax for once in her life? Quit drinking all that fucking bureaucratic Kool-Aid. "Yup. No means no. You simply cannot play that cello without a security clearance," Tara pronounced with an air of finality. "End of discussion," Adeena snapped. Losing access to that cello was worth fighting for, even if it meant losing her job and her best friend. "Thanks, Tara. You're a great administrator," Adeena snorted. "Protecting the government from bad girls like me. What's next? You going to post my criminal record on Facebook? Why don't you just trust me?" Tara glared at Adeena, fuming. "That cello is worth $5 million, Adeena," Tara replied. "It's not a matter of trust. If something happens to it, we void the insurance and then we're fucked," Adeena barked in a mocking tone. Pablo and the carpenter both grimaced and looked at Tara. "You're out of line, Miss Stewart," Tara bristled. "Good!" Adeena shouted. "I'm tired of being in line, following all your stupid rules that make absolutely no sense. You've got a cellist with the NAC orchestra, and you hire a high school dropout to play a precious instrument he can barely even tune? He's a dropout with a level 1 security clearance. I bet he doesn't have a police record. Yeah, that's because he still lives at home sucking his mother's milk all day. You're dismissed, Miss Stewart," Tara said coldly. "Please leave." "Gladly. Good luck opening your exhibit in 2 weeks. Your other slaves are all out getting lobotomies at the mall. I'm sure they'll make great researchers." The instruments in Thomas Peters' shop in Gatineau, across the river from Ottawa, did not come cheaply. For the past 25 years, the luthier had created nearly a whole orchestra worth of stringed instruments, including reproductions of originals created by Antonio Stradivari. Thomas, who started working on violins at 13, studied violin making in France and Italy after leaving Belgium, and honed his craft across Europe with specialized training in the restoration of Baroque-era stringed instruments. More than a few members of the NAC orchestra played on a violin, viola, or cello created in his small Victoria Street workshop. Thomas spent time getting to know each musician who commissioned an instrument from him. He wanted to understand their preferences regarding the tone they wanted, the comfort and playability sought, and of course the overall look of the handcrafted instrument he would create for them. He finished each one lovingly, in the knowledge it would be played for many years and handed down from generation to generation. Adeena had heard about Thomas Peters from Walter, who played one of his cellos and often talked about the luthier's understanding of relationship between musician and musical instrument. Walter said Thomas was a master craftsman who was moved by the music that was produced by the cellos and violins he created. He even cared for each of his children long after they left his workshop, with regular maintenance and ever so precise adjustments. Adeena, cooling off after locking horns with Tara, was at home scowling at her computer screen. She regretted letting her temper get the better of her. Tara was a true friend that she had always relied on. Maybe someday I'll be there for her, Adeena thought. If only she could get that broom out of her ass. Tara needed something or someone who would sweep her off her feet. Somebody who showed her that ecstasy doesn't come from balancing a budget or writing another fucking report. Trying to stay focused and put Tara out of her mind, Adeena continued to browse Thomas Peters' website. She read about his background and training. His workshop blog was full of detailed accounts of the instruments he created or restored, and the musicians he had worked with over the years. She read how Thomas sometimes replicated instruments that inspired him, such as the Lady Tennant, a violin crafted in 1699 by Antonio Stradivari. It survived dozens of owners, numerous wars, and ended up in Scotland, where Sir Charles Tennant gave it as a gift to his wife Marguerite, an amateur violinist. It was sold in 2005 for over $2 million and was loaned to the Belgian violinist Josef Ivanov. Apparently Thomas was so moved by the story of the violin's journey to his fellow countrymen that he devoted himself to a painstaking recreation of the Baroque-era instrument. Adeena picked up her phone to call him. She had a very special assignment for him, one she hoped he would not be able to resist. Thomas Peters wanted to get to work a little earlier than usual this morning. He swept a hand over his receding hairline, as if stroking his shock of chestnut-colored hair would somehow propel him more quickly down the street. Thomas had an extra jump in his 45-year-old legs today. He touched his glasses as he caught sight of his quaint two-story red-brick shop, which lay just ahead of him. He was more eager to be at work than he had been in some time. His workshop, home to many of the same tools used by string instrument makers for the last 300 years, took up the first floor of a renovated two-story house on a little street near the Canadian Museum of History. As he turned the key and opened the heavy wooden front door, he wondered about how he should handle the strange request he had received yesterday afternoon. The National Gallery of Canada needed a replica of the Duncan Cello, and they needed it fast. He had been dying to see it since he learned it was in Ottawa, and now, in a few minutes, a woman from the gallery was bringing it for him to see firsthand. She was a friend of Walter Leo, one of his oldest and most loyal customers. While a pot of his aromatic loose-leaf English breakfast tea sat steeping near his workbench, he scanned his email and opened a web browser. Within a few minutes, he had found the Duncan Cello and began reading about its history and its creator, Robert Duncan of Aberdeen. Thomas studied pictures of the cello closely. He guessed that its creator had spent time in Cremona, Italy. Robert Duncan might have even worked with Antonio Stradivari himself, according to the background information he read. Adjusting his reading glasses as he absorbed the information on his screen, Thomas sat back and poured himself a steaming mug of tea. As he stirred in a little sugar, he wondered what it would have been like for the young Scottish craftsman to apprentice with the master himself. What secrets had he learned? What insights had he gained into the acoustics, the varnishes, and 100 other tiny details that only someone who created an instrument from bundles of raw wood could truly appreciate? A knock on the front door startled him from his thoughts. As he sat his mug down, the front door opened slowly. He stood up from his stool. "Hello?" a woman called out. She stepped inside, holding a large BAM cello case, usually reserved for shipping instruments overseas. He knew the hard-shell silver-gray case was designed to protect its precious cargo suspended snugly inside on plush cushions. "Hi!" he responded, stepping closer to greet her. "Thomas Peters. Let me help you with that." He took the cello case from her and stood it beside him. "Thanks, I'm Adeena. We talked yesterday on the phone," she said. "Thank you so much for making time to see me." Thomas looked at the young woman standing before him. Her long, copper-tinged hair and green eyes were striking. Somehow she had the look and carriage of a classical musician, the featured virtuoso. "No problem. Thank you for calling me," he replied. Come in, come in. I just Googled your cello and was reading about it. Fascinating." Adeena's eyes lit up, and the force of her smile almost knocked him over. What was it the Borg used to say to their victims before they were absorbed into the collective? Resistance is futile. A beautiful classical musician, carrying a $5 million Baroque instrument, could have just about anything she wanted in this workshop. "Let's take a look at your cello," he smiled as Adeena took off her jacket and placed it over a chair. He laid the case down on the floor. She leaned over and unfastened the latches of the BAM flight case, revealing another cello case nested inside. Gingerly, she opened the second case, revealing the prize he had been so anxious to see. She stood back after opening it, so he could see it for himself. "The Duncan Cello," Thomas said reverently, absorbing the full majesty of the old instrument. He sighed in appreciation. "Oh, very nice. Yes, I can see he must have learned his craft in Italy. I think he apprenticed in Stradivari's workshop." "Robert Duncan? The man who built the cello?" Adeena asked. "Yes, his style is definitely influenced by Stradivari, and from what I've been reading, he likely spent time in Cremona, perhaps even working with him." He carefully lifted the cello from its case and laid it on the blanket that covered his workbench. Adeena sat down on a stool beside Thomas as he delicately examined the cello, like a jeweler inspecting a precious gem. He used a lamp attached to a hinged arm positioned over his bench to illuminate the instrument, studying every edge and groove of the antique subject that lay before him. "Can you do it?" Adeena finally asked. "In a week?" Thomas looked up and studied the young woman sitting beside him. This was no government bureaucrat. There was a fire inside her that could melt stainless steel. He thought for a moment before responding. "The replica you need? It's for display only. No one will play it?" he asked. "No musician will play it," she said with what sounded like a hint of sarcasm. "It's really just for display, but it has to look exactly like the real Duncan Cello. We need a kind of stunt double to fill in for the exhibit whenever the real one is." She hesitated for a moment. "You know, removed from the exhibit. The real Duncan needs to be played every day." He nodded. It did make sense, and he knew that if this was essentially a prop, he could meet the deadline, as long as he dropped everything else. "You play, right, Adeena? Did I hear you say you're with the NAC Orchestra?" he asked. "Yes, I just got offered a position. We're starting rehearsals this week," she replied. Thomas smiled and offered his hand to her. "Congratulations! I knew there was an opening. It's quite an accomplishment. Would you do me the honor of playing for me? I'd love to hear the tone of this cello. I've been wondering about it since you called me yesterday." "Oh." She hesitated, and Thomas wondered if he was being too forward. Some musicians didn't need much coaxing, especially when he created the companion so integral to their artistry, but not all musicians felt that way. "Yes, certainly. It's so special to play," Adeena said, lifting the instrument from its case. She looked up at Thomas. "I have some music that was first performed on this cello in the 18th century." Thomas took a step back and sat down as she got ready to play for him. This was turning out to be quite a morning.